Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics live stream. I am your host, Sarah, and I am joined once again by John and our other special guest co-host, Eddie from Midwestern Marx. We are joined again by Dan Kovalik, an American human rights lawyer, author, and law professor critiquing U.S. foreign policy and advocating for social justice. He has written books such as The Plot to Scapegoat Russia and No More War, but today he is here to talk about his most recent book, which is The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters, and Why You Should Care. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm great, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And the boys. Sundays are for the boys.
For sure. I'll ask the first question then. I was really excited to see that you put out a book on Palestine, because you have such a clear and concise way of breaking down these complex geopolitical issues in a way that, working class people can understand. Been a huge fan of your Venezuela book for a while, so it's great to see that you're putting out an analysis of Palestine, and I highly recommend everyone pick it up. But one of the things that your book talks about is the media bias that exists against the Palestinians and in favor of the Zionist apartheid state. Oftentimes, we'll see, misleading words used in the headline where Palestinians are killed, but Israelis are murdered. Even if the Palestinians being killed are 3 years old. Oftentimes, they won't tell us who actually murdered those children. They'll just say, Palestinian kids killed in Israel-Hamas war. Is how it's often framed. And of course, we recently learned that CNN actually has to pass their stories through an approval process where it goes through the Jerusalem Bureau, who basically takes out any pro-Palestinian content and weeds it out and makes it acceptable for a Zionist audience. So you want to talk about the media bias and the analysis you give in your book?
Yes. First of all, again, thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be here. Yes. I mean, first of all, without that media bias, Israel could not have been doing what it's been doing since October 7th. And that is carrying out this genocide that we're watching in real time on social media anyway. Again, not in the press as much, but on social media, we're seeing these horrible videos, photos of infants being killed, women being killed. In one case, they called a 3-year-old girl young lady, again, because they didn't want to say a little girl, a little toddler, a baby. And this is the type of propaganda that's been happening since 1948. It's been a propaganda that either wholly pretends the Palestinians don't even exist as a people, right? They're just invisible. In fact, Palestinians are Semitic people, right? But you're only anti-Semitic if you are anti-Jewish, not anti-Palestinian. Or to the extent the Palestinians have been acknowledged, they've been utterly dehumanized as terrorists, for example. And again, you see that in the coverage. Why is Hamas always treated as a terrorist group and not the Israeli Defense Forces, which are the ones that, frankly, do the lion's share of the killing? Look at the numbers they rack up versus Hamas. But in general, I would say, and this has been true for a long time, there's this awful ratio, it seems, that Westerners can put up with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Arabs versus one or two white people, right? They go crazy if a couple white people are killed, but they can really tolerate the deaths of literally millions of Arabs, and it's not a huge concern. And of course, the U.S. got away with, it's estimated killing something like 4 million Arabs in the world in the war on terror. And again, very little tears are shed for that. And that is how, again, Israel's gotten away with what it's gotten away with for so long, because the deaths of the Palestinians are just, the Palestinian lives are not as valuable as Israeli lives in the view of Western governments and the press. And that's been absorbed a lot by the people. They've been conditioned to feel that way. and to be conditioned to feel somehow that Palestinian parents don't love their children like we love our children. And that was true during all the wars the U.S. fights. The Vietnamese were treated in the same way, right? And the Koreans, and you just go down the line. It's the only way that a genocide can be carried out, is to dehumanize the victims, and that's been effectively done. And thank goodness, for the first time really ever, that is starting to break apart. Westerners, at least the people, are starting to see the Palestinians as human beings whose lives matter, and but that's not thanks at all to the mainstream press. It's thanks to shows like this. It's thanks to the alternative press. It's thanks to social media.
Absolutely. I think the religious element is huge there too, with the demonization of the Arab world in the West. I know growing up in a Christian family, that was often used, even in our church. And I look back now and, don't know how I ever fell for it, but a lot of the propaganda centered around the idea that Islam is just this inherently violent religion that always leads to violent jihad or whatever. And it's you meet a few Muslim people, then grow up and leave small town rural Wisconsin, you realize it's just not the case, that they have deep faith the same way Christian people have deep faith that guides their lives and their actions. And the way it's been contorted in the Western media is really disgusting. But additionally, in your book, you talk about the horrific hospital attacks that we've seen. At Midwestern Marx, we've got a buddy right now who's in Gaza, actually bringing 3D printed medical supplies to people. His name's Libre. He's a hero.
Wow.
But, yeah.
That's amazing.
Oh, sorry.
No, my hat's off to him. That's terrific. I'm very impressed.
Sure. He's a hero. But anyways, you talk about the attacks on hospitals, which has wiped out a lot of their medical supplies, which is why Libre's over right now. But we've argued for days with Zionists who deny that this happened, who deny that there were targeted attacks on these hospitals, even though we have, endless videos and eyewitness sources and mountains of evidence proving that these hospitals were in fact deliberately targeted. And we're seeing children horrific images of children regularly sliced in half by missiles and the most horrific stuff that you could possibly imagine. And they still deny it. And it seems like the mainstream media doesn't really talk about this. So how do you think we've reached this level of desensitization as a society, desensitization to this kind of horrific violence? And what can we do to fix it?
Yeah, well, I think, again, the desensitization comes, first of all, before there's even desensitization, it's what you're saying. I mean, it's just denial that this is even happening, right? Or if it is happening, it's an accident, or it's because Hamas allegedly has tunnels under the hospital. And of course, I mentioned in the book, I think the Washington Post did a story, at least on one of the hospitals, one of the big hospitals that was attacked, and actually did debunk the idea that there's Hamas tunnels underneath them. But again, they either excuse them or just outright deny that these are happening. But as you say, to the extent it's admitted, or to the extent that we're to believe that these hospitals are being purposefully attacked, there is a desensitization. I mean, in part because it's just part and parcel of the wars that the West has been carrying out, particularly on the Muslim world since 9/11, but even before, in Iraq, for example, in both wars in 1990 to 91, and also the war that began in 2003, the main targets were civilian, right? And it was true, for example, in the first Gulf War, 90 to 91, that the U.S. targeted electric plants, electric supplies, water supplies. These were the first targets. That was true, by the way, also in Serbia in 1999, when NATO had a 78-day bombing of Serbia. Mostly those were civilian targets. And again, the desensitization comes in part because it's just people are used to it, because that's what NATO does, because that's what the West does. And again, it goes back to that dehumanization, that we are led to believe that these people who are being targeted, whose hospitals are being targeted, are somehow less human. And so it's easier for people to accept that and not empathize with these folks. Some of it is, though, maybe a defense mechanism. I mean, if you fully emotionally grasped what was happening now in Gaza, it would be a painful, painful thing to live through day after day, which many of us are living through. I mean, many of us are in great pain to see this, to see hospitals being destroyed, to see every university there being destroyed, some of them through very methodical, planned, controlled demolitions, right? Not just through bombing. I mentioned in the book, one of the universities, they actually very slowly set dynamite to and just blew it up. This is a hateful, hateful thing that is happening. Christian churches destroyed, mosques destroyed. And that's another thing I mentioned, the Christian churches. You know, you mentioned how we dehumanize Muslims, which is true, but also part of what we do is deny that there's Palestinian Christians, because that is not a fact that is convenient to the story. Of course, Jesus Christ was a Palestinian, which is also not discussed, because, of course, that hits very close to home when you have Palestinian Christians being wiped out. And they are in Gaza. I think at the time that the war began, there were only 1,000 Palestinian Christians left there because of the terrible conditions that had been inflicted upon Gaza. Most of the Christians had left. And there's this kind of, again, to the extent that they admit there's Palestinian Christians, they trying to claim that it was Hamas that persecuted those Christians, which is totally untrue, absolutely untrue. It's the Israelis that have persecuted those Christians. And again, that's an inconvenient fact. But yeah, the desensitization is a huge issue. And, you know, just as an honorable mention, we should say there's people around the world that are being murdered right now in places that are not discussed, like the Congo, that the West is involved in. And we just absolutely those people are invisible to us entirely, even more than the Palestinians are. So there's a lot of dehumanization to go around and desensitization that we have to fight against.
You have something to say, John?
Yeah, well, just to kind of highlight that point, I think you mentioned the concept of the golden billion, and I think that is very prescient, because really Western human rights, that is as far as the notion of human rights extends, right? And that's what we're seeing unfold. So, right, it isn't just necessarily directed against Islam, but it's all of these different forces that are outside of that golden billion that has been basically protected and coddled by the notion of Western human rights. But that it doesn't extend to the other 7 billion people on planet Earth. And we're seeing those contradictions come into focus and be so undeniable now because of the different forms of media and the fact that we're getting to see this unfold in real time. It just exposes the contradictions for what they are. And I like that you highlighted that concept of the golden billion.
Thank you. Yeah, and I comes down to that, you know, the 7 billion people or so in the world that are forgotten, dehumanized, live in countries that the West is exploiting, just on an incredible scale, right? To mine minerals and get cheap labor. And that's all those people are to us, is cheap labor, right? For the most part. And again, the only way to live with ourselves is to deny their humanity, right? Because when you have to put your head around the fact that there are children who are mining our minerals so we can have our cell phones, the reality of that is terrible. It's absolutely unacceptable. But we accept it somehow. And as you say, it's human rights for those in the global north who are doing the exploiting. That's this, those are the people that are cared about. But we are moving away from that, as you say. That is something to take some heart in. These protests on behalf of Gaza in the West are something that I don't want to say are totally new. I mean, in the West, there's been a great history and of protest on behalf of, as you say, the kind of the forgotten 7 billion. There was obviously huge protests during the Vietnam War. There were huge protests in the run-up to the Iraq War. But these are the first real significant protests on behalf of the Palestinian people. And to see people running around with keffiyehs around their necks, it's a beautiful thing. And the Palestinians see that. I mean, even in Gaza, right? You're seeing people with tents that say, "Thank you, university students." So there is an awakening that's happening. And that we should be thankful about. And the more people awaken to the suffering of people in the global South, the more that it will be hard, the more difficult it will be to just exploit those people and kill those people with frankly just reckless abandon, as has been happening.
Absolutely. That's one of the things our buddy Libre, who's in Gaza, told us, is that he hears the Palestinians talking all the time. Like, did you hear the Americans are protesting, or did you hear, the Americans are actually fighting back? So it's awesome to see, and hopefully that just, continues and grows exponentially as more people become educated and figure out what's going on. It's easy to fall for imperialist propaganda when the media is beating the war drums, right? And a lot of people are like anti-imperialist in hindsight. Like they'll support the intervention when the media and the politicians are telling them to support it, but then 10 years later they're like, "Oh yeah, that was based on lies." But you talk about one of the most effective lies in U.S. history in your book, in the Naira testimony. About these babies who were being taken out of incubators and left on the floor to die, and you compare that to the beheaded babies story that we heard recently about Hamas on October 7th, allegedly beheading babies. And of course, there's been no evidence for this, but I would say a large portion of Americans still believe it to this day because the media pushed it so hard when it came out. So can you talk about that a little bit and the parallels between those two stories?
Yeah, no, it is an interesting, thing to compare those two. So in the run-up to the first Gulf War in 1990-91, there was this story that when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, that some of the Iraqi soldiers went to this hospital, and they saw babies in incubators and threw them on the floor, killing them. And this was a big story that helped. This is, obvious war propaganda now, but at the time, it was viewed as a truth, and this helped pave the way for consent for the war against Iraq. Now, of course, that did turn out. I think by now everyone has admitted that was just a lie. That wasn't true. But as I mentioned in the book. And then there's the 40 beheaded babies on October 7th. It didn't happen. Apparently there's this IDF military commander who made it all up, and Biden would later say he saw photos of it. No photos of it exist. But again, that sort of lie, the lie of the mass rapes, which is also a lie, on October 7th, they paved the way for the genocide. To this day, as you say, even once those things have been debunked or largely debunked, even if there's an acknowledgement of that, which there has not been yet, there has been pretty much an acknowledgement in the mainstream press that the 40 dead babies wasn't true. The mass rape story still lingers, though I think, was it the Times of London? I think I'm correct in that, is one of the first mainstream publications that now has questioned the mass rape story. But so all of these, and of course there was the mass rape claim against Gaddafi in 2011. That ended up being totally debunked, right? The claim that he was giving out Viagra to his troops to rape people in Libya. That was a huge justification for the war. Again, that was debunked. But as I mentioned in the book, okay, yeah, those things are debunked. But guess what? There's real babies being killed in Gaza, thousands. There's real incubator babies killed in Gaza. There's real babies being beheaded in Gaza. We've seen videos of them. There are real rapes that the IDF is carrying out and has carried out since 1948 against Palestinian people. There are rapes that are happening in Israeli prisons as we speak. And by the way, the New York Times did acknowledge that recently at the bottom of an article. But again, why aren't people hitting the panic button about that? Why isn't that matter? 40 alleged beheaded babies was more alarming to the press and to initially the public than what? What are we up to? 16,000 dead Gazan children? It's an incredible. So one, you have incredible lies that are justify all the wars. You know, pretty as Orwell said, it's often quoted, but it's a great quote. The first casualty of war is truth, and that is so true, right? It's every war that the West has fought, and you can see that there was a big lie to justify that, and that later, as you say, generally end up being debunked. The weapons of mass destruction in Iraq is a famous one. But as you say, sadly, most of the public is willing to believe the next lie, right? Which is kind of incredible. Yeah, they lied about Libya. Yeah, they lied about Iraq. Yeah, they lied about Yugoslavia. But they're not lying now, right? There's an incredible gullibility. But at the same time, what you also have is this incredible double standard, right? That even if the lie were true, what's happening in Palestine is infinitely worse by the numbers. Even if you believe the 40 beheaded babies, there's beheaded babies in Gaza that exceed that by huge multiples. And so that's also the incredible part of this story. And again, the people are harping on October 7th over and over and over, as if what happened to the Israelis is more significant than what is happening to the people of Gaza, right? And that again goes back to this dehumanization, this double standard that we have, that where the life of a white person is 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times more valuable than the life of a Palestinian person or a Congolese person. It's really, it's awful. It's insidious, but it's a reality. It works, and it does work. It does work to justify these wars.
So I do want to talk about some of the politics inside of Israel because they're kind of cloak and dagger to outsiders, especially. And we always say, it's the government, not we, but there's that. It's the government. It's not the Israelis. Let's talk about their political situation. So you talked about Benny Morris, who I thought was a great example because he's kind of put towards the forefront as this sort of liberal expert on Israel, Zionism, and he's done debates with Norm Finkelstein where they've just lost abysmally, but that's neither here nor there. But he calls himself a leftist, and I think he's a maniac, but that's because I'm so far to the left. But he calls himself a leftist, but what does that say about the Overton window in Israel? And also you said Netanyahuism, which I was wondering if you could describe just what that ideology kind of entails, and how did Israel get this far to the right?
Yeah, well, it is an interesting progression or digression. Is that the word? De-evolution in Israel. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that Zionism was always a philosophy that that carried within it this significant hatred of the Palestinian people, right, and dehumanization of them, that even the best Zionist would have some of that philosophy to some extent. I mean, it's the only way to justify the formation of Israel where people lived, right, and forcibly displacing them. You give the Benny Morris example, who actually has told a lot of truths about what happened during the Nakba. And he's famous for that. He's very important for revealing there were mass rapes during the Nakba, for example. But at the same time, he's openly said, yeah, but I just think they didn't do enough ethnic cleansing in 1948. They should have pushed all the Palestinians out. He has said that. And that is not just a majority view in Israel, particularly now. It's you know, you can't find a lot of Israelis who don't agree with that. Now, there are some, and those people need to be acknowledged. You have the Elon Papes, who, God bless them, are people, they're Israelis who are very good, kind people who care about the Palestinians. There's people in the West Bank, Israelis, that will, try to protect Palestinians from aggression. But the numbers of those people is tiny, and has gotten tinier over the years. There used to be a significant left in Israel. There was a significant communist party. There still is one, but it's very tiny now. There used to be even a Labor Party, which again was, they had a high level of tolerance for Palestinian suffering, don't get me wrong, but was a little kinder and gentler, right? You had something, in fact, called labor Zionism that the Labor Party represented. You had a lot of socialist Zionists. And again, the fact they were Zionists at all meant that they supported the project, and that also meant displacing Palestinian people. But again, they had more regard for Palestinian life than the right wing. But the right wing has taken over. That's what has to be acknowledge now, that over the years what has happened is the good Israelis have just left, right? The people who cared about the Palestinians just said, hey, I can't do this anymore, this is not right, and felt crowded out by the right, because the right really has taken over Israel in a big way since the 1970s. There's Netanyahuism, but really Netanyahuism sees its roots in Menachem Begin, who was one of the key founders, I mentioned that, of Israel, who Albert Einstein, for example, said was a fascist. Well, he became prime minister.
Of course he did.
In the 70s. And his party that he founded would later become the Likud party, which is Netanyahu's party. They've governed Israel for the most part, for the lion's share of the last 50 years. And of course, Netanyahu's been the leader of Israel for an almost unbroken 20 plus years, right? So it's kind of, I have friends who would just say, oh yeah, the Israelis are doing some terrible things, but that's Netanyahu, right? That's because he's a nut, but he's ruled Israel for like a quarter of its existence. So what does that say? You claim Israel is a democracy, and you have this prime minister you acknowledge is crazy, or at least in your view, crazy. Well, it's because he's not crazy. He represents a large swath of the Israeli population, and even those who don't like him in Israel, and there's plenty of them, they support his policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. They support this war. They support the genocide. And that's a sad truth. If Netanyahu were to, leave the scene tomorrow, there'd be another leader like him to take his place, or worse. Because Zionism has become a right-wing philosophy again, and then Einstein had predicted that. Others have predicted it, that because it's racist, right? To begin with, Zionism has within it this belief of the supremacy, the racial superiority of one people, the Jewish people, over Muslim people. I mean, it is by definition racist. And so it was always going to end this way, with this kind of horrible bloodletting that we're seeing in Gaza. And that's the truth of it. And it took me years to believe that. Again, I for a long time kind of drank the Kool-Aid about Israel. I mean, I could be, obviously critical of it and all, but I didn't see how just rotten to the core its philosophy was. And now that's being really writ large. That's just impossible to ignore now. What we're seeing in Gaza was always part of the plan. It's always part of the plan. And Netanyahu seized October 7th simply to carry it out. And I use this term in the book, and others are using it now. It is the final solution for Israel. And that is a term of art. That is a Nazi term. The final solution for Hitler was the extermination of the Jews. And it's so ironically, right, painfully ironic, that the final solution for the Israelis is the extermination of the Palestinian people. And a lot of people are seeing that. So that's where we are. There, and of course, you see in the West and in the U.S., you see so many Jews who are opposing this, who are active, who are leading the protest, which is beautiful. Those people aren't living in Israel, right? And that's for a reason, and they never will. So for the most part, the good folks have left Israel, and they've ceded the ground to very, very dangerous right-wing people.
Well, Dan, that's a fantastic point, and it gets me to the next question that I wanted to ask, because in the West, we have such a way of thinking about politics that is very Orwellian, right? We have such short historical memories, and we're really only conditioned to remember and focus on these flashpoint events like October 7th. And of course, the war has ramped up now to a fever pitch as the genocide on Gaza unfolds. But as you mentioned, this has always been kind of the extermination of the Palestinians and the evisceration of the Palestinian state has always been core to the project of Israel. And so, you talk about the long war on Gaza, because over the last several decades, in order to systematically destroy the Palestinian state and squeeze Gaza, eviscerate the West Bank, the Palestinians have really been sentenced to this kind of purgatory, right? Where in Gaza, Israel has really kept Gaza's economy at the lowest possible level while also still trying to avoid like a full-blown humanitarian crisis. And this was kind of the status quo that was shattered on October 7th. So I would love to hear you expand on that point a little bit, and then also maybe describe from a psychological perspective what the significance of October 7th was to the Palestinian cause, and how this really upended Israel's long-running psychological warfare on the Palestinians.
Yeah. So what happened in Gaza was, and I'm trying to get my dates correct, somewhere around, I want to say 2008. Am I right? 2008, 2009. Israel had been occupying Gaza up to that point, and then they decided they did not want to occupy Gaza anymore, that was not an effective way to manage the Palestinian people. So they withdrew from Gaza, encircled it with these huge fences, and then started to essentially keep the Palestinians on a barely subsistent diet, literally diet, right? They figured out how many calories the Palestinians needed to live, and they guaranteed that they would have a little less than that. That's a true story, right? That they would barely survive on the food and the water and the electricity that was being allowed to them. And they would, yes, destroy the infrastructure over time, which they've done, every several years, Israel would attack Gaza, destroy a cement factory, right? And a bakery, and destroy this and destroy that, left them with nothing, no economy, they left them as beggars, right? And you have like horrible people like Robert F. Kennedy, who, recently said, oh, these are pampered people because they live off of humanitarian aid. No, that was the plan. The plan is they would have to live solely on humanitarian aid so that aid could be, again, measured and it could be lowered whenever necessary to keep the Palestinians under control, right? So you had a people that were utterly degraded, that could, were left in a situation where they could not, economically function, could not provide for themselves, and they were barely provided from outside sources. And so by 2018, the United Nations predicted that by 2020, that was 4 years ago, Gaza would be unlivable, literally unlivable. And that time has come and gone, and it became unlivable. And so on October 7th, what happened then has to be seen as a response to the fact that Gaza had been made completely unlivable. You had people that were living literally in a concentration camp, right? It was a concentration camp. They couldn't leave. They were, again, forced to live on rations that barely kept them alive. October 7th was a jailbreak. It was a Warsaw Ghetto-like uprising. And of course, everyone applauds the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, right? During World War II, and they should. And that's exactly what October 7th was. It was the uprising of a people that had been, by the way, tried to do peaceful protest, right? Remember the March of Return protests that happened several years before, in which people peacefully marched to the border of Gaza and Israel and said that they had a right to return and wanted to return. They were gunned down daily by the Israeli forces. Many killed, many more crippled. That's what they got for peaceful protest. In fact, Norman Finkelstein kind of blames himself, right? Because he was urging them, the people of Gaza, oh, just try peaceful non-resistance. Well, that's what they got. And he's admitted that was not a good idea. It was not a good idea. Even Gandhi said, if you're going to try nonviolent civil disobedience, the people you're trying that against have to have a conscience. They have to have enough of a conscience to care, right? No one thinks you could try that against the Nazis. And ultimately, the people of Palestine figured that out. And on October 7th, they decided to take up arms and do something about it. And it was, however you view what happened on October 7th, it worked. It showed, one, the Israelis were not the all-powerful military they claimed to be, that they had weaknesses, intelligence weaknesses, weaknesses in responding. They end up also killing a lot of their own people. It looked like a total scene of chaos, right? And so the Israelis were caught and embarrassed with their pants down. So from that point of view alone, that was significant. But also, in some ways, like civil disobedience is meant to do, it caused a reaction from Israel, which showed how evil Israel is, by how they responded to October 7th. Now, was that part of the plan? I don't know. I don't know if years from now Hamas will say, well, I don't know, that we plan on that. We knew that it would be terrible, but ultimately that people would see what this was all about finally, which has happened. Or if they would say, well, we thought more people would come to our aid than have, and they would be legitimately frustrated because that hasn't happened. But whatever, it was another, I think, metaphor would be the raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. It was a raid on Harper's Ferry to destroy slavery, right? It will be seen in that kind of light. as something that not only changed the relations between Palestine and Gaza, but it changed the world. Look at what's happened. Look at the just public uprising with the Palestinian people. The Palestinians have radicalized the West. And that's an incredible thing. These people, 2.3 million poor people, have changed the world. That's an incredible thing. I mean, what this has shown is not, again, this isn't just how the Palestinians will view October 7th, but the world will. It'll be seen as a revolutionary moment, on par with any revolutionary moment, with the October Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the American Revolution. It's on par with that. And I don't know if anyone could have really predicted that. I don't think these things are always predictable, but I think it is that type of moment.
Well, speaking of revolutions and freedom fighters, Hamas released a document. The mailman just came. Hamas released a document in January 2024, so quite recently, reiterating the fact and the fact of like who the actual enemy is. They stated, they affirmed that their conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews, because of religion, and they acknowledged that the Holocaust and reminded people that the Jewish problem is a European problem, and the current conflict is due to the Zionist alliance with the West. I don't know if you've noticed there's a tone shift happening in the United States where kind of Jews are just sort of becoming a scapegoat in a way. And I think that it's interesting that not only Hamas, but also Nasrallah feels the need to constantly reiterate what they know Zionism to be, and it's not just a Jewish construct. What can you take it a little bit more? Take it a little further. Why they feel the need to constantly reiterate this? Is it that Israel's making it into a religious war, and they want to pull back from that?
Yes, well, yes, because Israel, of course, has used the claim of anti-Semitism as a bludgeon against anyone who would defend the Palestinian people, right? And they have equated supporting Palestinians for being anti-Semitic. And so what has happened is Hamas, and as you say, Hezbollah have gone out of the way to say, well, this isn't about being anti-Semitic. It's not about being anti-Jewish. It's about being anti-Zionist. It's about being against the occupation and being against the genocide, not being against Jews, which is true, and which, I think most of the protesters in the U.S. have tried to also make that distinction. And again, I think it should be easy to make, given that, you have Muslims, Christians, and Jews marching arm in arm in these protests. And that distinction has to be made. But it's important that Hamas is making it because, again, the claim that Israel makes is that Hamas is anti-Semitic, that they just hate Jews. And if they won, if Hamas were victorious, they would just kill all the Jews, right? That's a big claim of Israel. And that is what justifies what they do. That even justifies killing children, because every Palestinian is seen as an anti-Semite, a would-be anti-Semite who will one day grow up and kill Jews, right? And Hamas is saying, no, that's not what it's about. And the Holocaust was a terrible thing. But yeah, it was a European thing. That's the incredible sleight of hand that has happened here, right? That Israel, not just Israel, but Great Britain and Germany and the United States and the West, has somehow diverted attention from the fact that it was Germany that carried out the Holocaust, right? And instead of Germany compensating the Jews for the Holocaust, somehow they've made the Palestinians have to compensate for it with their land and literally their lives. And part of being able to do that is somehow, and you'll see this, somehow to even blame the Palestinians for the Holocaust in some weird, subtle way that is intimated, right? With Israel often saying that the Hamas are Nazis, the people in Gaza are Nazis. And again, they'll claim they'll find a copy of Mein Kampf in a kid's bedroom or something like that, they begin to equate the Palestinians with the Nazis, and that's just insane. But again, that has worked somehow. Somehow it's worked. In the minds of the West, there's some logic to all that. And somehow, for example, Germany feels that by supporting the genocide, and they are, I think they've upped their arms shipments to Israel by huge numbers during this war. I think they provide Israel with 30% of its weapons. I was surprised when I read about that. But they somehow see that as making up for the Holocaust by supporting another Holocaust. I mean, it's absolute. Some of this is absolute madness, and it's just psychological projection, right? And that is, as Freud would talk about, if I don't like something about myself, I blame you for it, or I claim you're that. Right. If I'm an alcoholic, I see you as an alcoholic because, I diverted away from myself. And that's what the West is doing. Like, hey, we didn't carry out the Holocaust. They did. They're the guilty ones somehow. And the whole thing's a giant projection. It's a really fascinating thing that's happening. Again, that's finally kind of withering away given the undeniable genocide that's being carried out in Gaza, but it's taken a long time for that psychological mind to be dismantled. So
I wanted to get, we're probably not going to get to, but I wanted to dedicate a lot of time to the persecution of the Christian church, because you gave it an entire chapter. So the Armenian Christians, obviously the cathedrals, St. Porphyrius was hit, and Christian hospitals. So I thought it was worth noting that Palestinian Christians have been pretty much completely cleansed from their homeland. I mean, I think there's like 2,000 left or something tiny. I know quite a few in the diaspora, but you also noted in this book that Israel participated. We talk about it a lot. Israel's participation in the ethnic cleansing of Armenian Orthodox Christians from Artsakh, or some might know it as Nagorno-Karabakh. At which Azerbaijan helped to cleanse with Israeli weapons. They're one of Israel's largest arms buyers. And they recently attacked Christian sites in southern Lebanon, including St. George's Church, which is the second time they've attacked it since October 7th. Many people lately have been pointing out an overarching theme of anti-Christian actions from Israel. But we also say this isn't based on religion at all. So with the Christians, is it based on religion, or is it just that their imperialistic goals kind of line up this way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's a complex question, but I think there's a utilitarian basis for this, and that the utilitarian basis for this for the Israelis is, it is an inconvenient fact that there are Palestinian Christians, right? Because the Zionists are aligned, first of all, with the West that generally considers itself to be Christian, right? Even if they're not theocracies, the U.S. considers itself, for example, to be a Christian country, and it's mostly Christian. So first of all, because of that, it's very inconvenient for Israel to have Palestinian Christians running around, because it's like, oh, I thought we were supposed to help Christians, and we're Christians, but we're killing Christians. That's not cool, right? That's very inconvenient. So that's part of it. And also Israel is aligned, the Zionists are very much aligned with Christian Zionists. So even a portion of the West that is rabidly pro-Israel, because they believe that if Israel takes over Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, that Jesus Christ will come back. The second coming will come. So that, again, it's inconvenient to talk about the fact that for that to happen, they're going to have to get rid of the Christians too, right? So part of it is that they're trying to get rid of any, not just the Palestinian Christians, but any memory that they even existed, right? Because of those alignments, it's not a convenient thing. But also, I mentioned in the book that there is, and it's been a real preoccupation of mine going back years is the war on liberation theology that the United States in particular has been carrying out since 1962. And Noam Chomsky was also a big promoter of talking about this. I was raised Roman Catholic, and my first entree into leftism was liberation theology. So this was a big preoccupation of mine. The murder of Oscar Romero, who's now a saint, he's a recognized saint by the Catholic Church, in 1980 when I was 12, was a really radicalizing thing for me. And it really would bring me to leftism. Not immediately, but eventually. It turned out the U.S. was backing the forces that killed Oscar Romero in El Salvador. That blew my mind, right? Again, I thought we were defending the faith around the world, not killing archbishops. And so I also think that the persecution of Christians, real Christians, by the way, Christians of the type that existed before the Holy Roman Empire declared itself as such, who believed in helping the poor, who believed in following Jesus by, giving up your possessions, which, of course, most of this is anathema to most Christians now, right? Those sorts of values are antithetical to capitalism, to put a fine point on. And that was something the U.S. saw after Vatican II, that they wanted to wipe out that burgeoning liberation theology that took a preferential treatment for the poor, because this would be a philosophy antithetical to capitalism and antithetical to the right-wing regimes that the U.S. was supporting throughout the world, but particularly in Latin America, many of which had support, by the way, from the mainstream Catholic Church, right, that aligned with the aristocracy in these countries. Well, the liberation theologians aligned with the people. Many of them were Marxist, and some of the priests, in fact, fought with the Marxist guerrillas and stuff. So I talk about both of these things in the book. It's an interesting thing that this persecution is happening in that context. That the historical roots of Christianity really are being destroyed, right? Christianity is being pulled out literally by the roots, because it grew up there in historic Palestine, and I think there's a number of reasons for it to be destroyed. The political reasons, because Zionism is aligned with the many Christian movements in the West, but also because it does represent the roots, the true roots of Christianity, which are really communist, small c communist. It ain't good for capitalism, right? So that's part of this too. And I hope I did it justice in that chapter. I think it's a complex thing to explain those things together, but it's something that's not discussed a lot. In the 80s, and a lot of us knew about that oppression of liberation theology. Now, most people, I would say, don't know what liberation theology is. I mean, because why? Because the U.S. did a great job of destroying it. I mean,
well, yeah, when I saw the chapter, that's why we we're going to dedicate a big chunk of this discussion. So I'm glad you brought it up. But I was like, what the hell is liberation theology? I went to Catholic school, and I was like, what is this? Like, I've never heard of this. So yeah, we were like, cool. Like, this is really interesting. I didn't know that was a concept that people could point to and say, like, we got to destroy that.
Yeah. Well, when I was in the 80s growing up, it was, liberation theology was still a big thing. The Sandinistas had taken power. They had a few Catholic priests in the government, right? There you go. When I discovered liberation theology as a Catholic, it blew my mind. I immediately embraced it, right? Because I immediately saw it as reflecting what I thought Jesus was trying to say, right? With, you should feed the hungry and clothe the naked, right? I mean, that's what liberation theology was to get back to the roots, the true roots of Christianity. Before it became the Holy Roman Empire. Once in 300, whatever it was, when Constantine declared Christianity is the faith of the Roman Empire, that communal aspect of Christianity largely died. And it became reborn in the 1960s with John the 23rd's Second Vatican Council. It was reborn. And particularly in Latin America, it became very powerful. And as Chomsky points out, the coup in 1964, which the U.S. supported, the military coup, was aimed at the heart of liberation theology, because Brazil was a big focal point of creating liberation theology. It's an amazing history. But yes, by the time young people like you became aware, liberation theology was largely a thing of the past. It had been successfully destroyed through the murder of scores of priests and bishops by the United States and its proxies. It's an amazing, amazing history and sad history. So I'm not surprised you wouldn't know about it, because again, it just was not. But again, one of the manifestations of liberation theology is Pope Francis, because he comes out of Argentina. He was the product of that. He will say openly, his two main mentors were communists, capital C communists, right? That's why a lot of people don't like Pope Francis. And there is this kind of growing schism in the Catholic Church, because he does represent liberation theology, though, again, he doesn't talk about it in those terms. So, again, that you wouldn't know the term is not surprising, but he kind of represents that strain of Christianity, which is very progressive. And there is a fight within the Catholic Church to really try to suppress that and to attack Francis and whatnot. So, yes, it's a fascinating part of history. And again, I think when you see what Israel's doing to the Christians, I think it's part and parcel of that as well.
Well, it seems like there's been a bit of a resurgence, maybe in the crystallization of the institutions that were associated with liberation theology, and then some of the states too, right? In the global South, particularly in Latin America. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about kind of the future of liberation theology, or the way that the war on Gaza might be kind of catalyzing some of these impulses that we saw historically, because that's one of the I think silver linings for me in all of this, is just to see how much solidarity is coming out of the global South. Countries like Bolivia that are under the threat of their own coup at this very moment. Countries like Nicaragua that have Ortega still being in power there, or Venezuela, or a number of countries, particularly in South and Central America, where this kind of notion of liberation theology is still present. So I wonder if you have any kind of musings about that, or the future of liberation theology and its role, not only in supporting the Palestinian cause, but also the development of a multipolar world.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Chavez himself, who really began the reemergence of the left in Latin America after it had largely been defeated, was definitely someone who was an advocate of liberation theology. He was a Christian, and he was a leftist and a socialist, as is Daniel Ortega, as you mentioned, the Nicaraguans. And that is, that is giving a rebirth, I do think, to this idea of liberation theology. It is a very powerful philosophy, and I don't think it will ever be totally dead. And I do think it is reemerging, and I hope more people in the West find it, because I do think it is a powerful thing. And I do think it does lead people like Chavez and then Maduro to embrace the Palestinians, right? Out of a philosophy of, frankly, kind of Christian love in a certain way. And as you say, you have Colombia, which has done that. Gustavo Petro, who's the president. I honestly don't know if he's into liberation theology. He was a Marxist guerrilla, so he has that going for him. and Bolivia as well. Yeah, they've been very vocally pro-Palestinian. And I do think that the influence of liberation theology cannot be underestimated in all of that. And there isn't there an irony to that, right? Because the Spanish, of course, conquered Latin America with the help of the Catholic Church, right? And by forcibly, converting indigenous people to Christianity, and it's, it's blossomed into something that's become anti-imperialist. Isn't that an irony?
Right. It's kind of amazing, because in Marxism we talk about like the positive sublation of something, right, to kind of move history forward in a progressive direction. And I just think that's such a beautiful example of that kind of positive sublation of a very dark chapter of history.
Yes.
Something much more sovereign and liberatory.
Nobody could have expected Daniel Ortega to take socialism and put Christianity in front of it and run a country on it.
It's a beautiful thing, and I've gone through many iterations in my life. I was raised a right-wing Roman Catholic. I got into liberation theology. And then, frankly, I, for a long time, ditched the theology part and just was a Marxist and pretty much, an atheist. And now I'm becoming much more open to religion, and not just to Christianity. Islam has a form of liberation theology, too. And actually, the Islamic Republic of Iran considers itself to embrace liberation theology. I learned that very recently. And when you look, I've told people, not only has kind of the movement in Latin America reawakened my faith to some extent, so has the Palestinian people. When you see their religious fervor, even as Islam's, when you see in Gaza, for example, have you seen that video of a destroyed mosque, a mosque destroyed by Israel? Right next to it, people on these rugs, hundreds of people praying next to the mosque in the rain, in these wet rugs, and these people patiently praying. And that sort of fervor, that sort of faith, which, by the way, cannot be underestimated as keeping the Palestinians alive, right? Without their faith, they could not have survived what they've gone through. There's, you saw that little girl. There's a video of a little girl. She was in the hospital. She had been injured, in some airstrike, and she was chanting the Quran to soothe herself, When religion is good, it's good, right? I mean, good religion is good. I'm not against, I think it can be empowering for people. And you see the Palestinians, I think, manifesting good religion, right? When you see the sharing that people have there, where people with only one loaf of bread and share it with other people. And that comes from that religious belief. And so, and in fact, I heard an Indian Marxist, I wish I could fully attribute what he said, because I don't remember his name, but I saw an Indian Marxist say that, he says, we have to admit as Marxists that probably right now the Muslims understand dialectics better than the Marxists do, and so, and I think that's true. So in any case, maybe I've digressed too much on that, but I do think people are finding a faith that I do think can be restorative, and I support that. And I feel moved by it. When I went to the West Bank, just being with the Palestinian people, they made me want to be a better person. That may sound trite, or the love that they showed. And again, I think some of that does come from the religion, this hospitality. In Islam, if you show up at someone's door and you don't have a place to stay, they have to let you in. They have to put you up, right? If you smell the food they're cooking, they have to feed you. These are beautiful things. I was very moved by that kind of hospitality, that kind of kindness. And I think the world's seeing that too, in Gaza too. And it's a beautiful thing. I think it's increased my spirituality. I think it probably has amongst a lot of people as well. So,
for sure. I mean, that leads perfectly into our last question here. One of our last questions about Gaza as sort of the moral center of the world. You mentioned how many people have been awoken by what they've seen unfold in Gaza. both politically or spiritually, like you were mentioning before. So what do you think about that idea? Is Gaza as the moral center of the world, and the idea that, you know, our struggle here against the imperialist government in the United States is the same struggle that the Palestinians are fighting against the Zionist entity, which is, of course, propped up by the U.S. empire?
Yeah. No, what you've witnessed in Palestine, the heroism, journalists risking their lives to do their job. More journalists have been killed in Palestine than in any conflict ever. More than in World War II. Can you believe that? And the doctors, these doctors who don't even have anesthesia to do surgery, and who are risking their lives to try to heal people. And the people going in to take people out of rubble, right? Every day. Can you imagine doing that every day? Only to know that that baby you just took out of rubble may die tomorrow in another bombing. But they're doing it. We are witnessing, and that's the thing, in a conflict like this, you witness incredible evil, but we are witnessing also alongside it incredible goodness, incredible courage. And that has to leaven you, right? That has to give you strength as a human being, and know that you can keep fighting during the worst. The Gazans are proving during the worst deprivation, the worst violence, humans can survive, and not just survive, they can continue to thrive, and they can continue to be good people. And that sort of, a people like that will never be defeated. I mean, I'm just sorry. You see that happening, you know they can't lose. You can't defeat that. They won't be defeated, and we won't be defeated if we act in that way. And we have a lot to learn from them, right? The West has really become so individualized, so devoid, I think, of any kind of true spirituality or belief in anything in many ways, right? That religion has kind of died, and nothing's really replaced it, right? And again, to see that kind of faith, and whatever it's faith in, that sort of fortitude, is something that should really inspire all of us to, one, be better people, to be more giving, but also, yes, to make social change, to create a world that's more like that. And that's our goal. That is our task. And the Palestinians are leading the way. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
Well, I bribed you into staying for the full hour, and then I even snuck in an extra
There you go.
minute.
There you go.
We had to get the moral center of the world question in there, because it really has become this sort of
It has. It brings tears to my eyes. It's humbling, and I've enjoyed this talk. It went very quickly, so it didn't
even notice the extra 15 minutes.
I didn't. So it's all good.
Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and what you've got coming up?
Yeah, so here's the book, The Case for Palestine. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it from my publisher, Skyhorse Publishing. Go to your bookstore if you want to buy it from them. If they don't have it, ask them to order it. So please do buy it. Author, you write stuff so people read it. So please get it and read it.
I want to stress that it's a really good book for people who may be semi-Zionists, baby Zionists, left-wing Zionists, or people that are just, this is their first foray into the Gaza-Israel conflict. This is really good as like an accessible and new things. Like just learning about liberation ideology, I'm down in a rabbit hole. So that's a really great book.
Thank
John
you.
and Eddie, any final thoughts?
No, thanks for coming on. I agree, everyone. Pick up Dan's book. Pick up his other books too. They're all fantastic. So it's always great to talk to you, and we both have the Christian background there, so I always love hearing from you on that. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Yeah, John. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just going to say many thanks, and I do really appreciate, about you as someone who covers the Palestinian struggle, that you also have this awareness of the liberation movements all over the world, and the struggle for multipolarity, and all of these things. And I think it just colors your analysis in a way that is really the most impactful for people. So yes, definitely go pick up Dan's book. And thank you so much, Dan, for joining.
Follow Midwestern Marx, follow John, follow Eddie, do all your chores and make your bed. It's another Sunday at DD Geopolitics. We will have an after space stream in about 10 minutes, or an after stream space in about 10 minutes. I don't know who's coming on the show next. Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm going to message Dugan. And for Samuel, I think that your name was, I will try for the Mexico episode because we do need to talk about that presidential election. I think I got everybody. Thank you, Cletus, for all of your super chats. And thank you, Mima, for saying that I'm brilliant. I need that like every once in a while. We will see you next time on the DD Geopolitics live stream. Thanks once again. And we will put you out with another liberation ideology country, Ireland. So big ups to Ireland, and go visit the store. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.